Welcome. This is something, you're not supposed to laugh yet. This is a brand new feature that we're using on TriTenacious. We've used YouTube for well over a year now for kind of 2 to 3 minute length feature videos, which have gone really well. And we've obviously used Instagram a lot, again for those like 1 minute videos. But what we wanted to do is to start to use our YouTube channel more once a week to almost have a, I'm not going to say chat show, because that wouldn't be it, but much more of a kind of conversational, sit down, I suppose talk to people like coaches.
Yeah, sure.
And have the chance to be able to bring to life a lot of the things that we talk about, speak about them in a bit more detail. So that's a really good value for you guys as well. But again, as coaches, as we were only talking about earlier, a big part of that is knowing the person and the personality, and you can't do that very easily just on a photo.
No.
And it's tough on a short video, isn't it? So we wanted to use this 15 minutes as a chance for you to really be able to get that information and insight that we share on strength and conditioning for triathlon performance, but in a way that seems a little bit more down to earth, a bit more human, a bit more grounded.
Shows a bit more of us as in our day to day and how we talk about it.
And hopefully people don't think we're mad or stupid or weird, but
Yeah,
we are
no.
who we are. We shall embrace that. The reason we did it with 15 minutes as well is we just felt that everybody's got 15 minutes once a week, and because YouTube is so accessible, whether you're in the car, because you've got it on sound, whether you're walking somewhere, whether you're at home, you can pretty much access it anywhere, can't you?
Yeah.
And yeah, 15 minutes is just something that you could do in the evening when the kids have gone to bed, your lunch break at work. There's no barrier as to why you can't watch this. So it's long enough for us to get some of that detail in, but not so short that we felt like it would become a bit of a labour each week. Yeah, a bit of a chore for people to be able to do. Craig is obviously sat to my left. Obviously, I am Dave. I was accused actually in the Instagram live last week of looking like I'm wearing pyjamas, which I'll take as a compliment. I'm not known for my training dress sense, but hopefully I'll make up for that in terms of some of the knowledge and insights we can give you for your triathlon strength and conditioning. I guess the final point as well before we get stuck in is there's nothing else like this, but this isn't elsewhere on YouTube, is it?
No, well, not even to do with triathlon, just in strength and conditioning in general. There's nothing, is there really?
Yeah.
That lays a platform and really gives an insight into coaches, but also some of the key areas in a particular sport or profession.
I guess we, in strength and conditioning, even though we are coaches, there is a tendency for us to want to hide behind keyboards and research papers, which makes no sense because we're coaches, and it's a bit of a challenge, and I can get why for coaches to want to get out onto social media and do something like this. As Craig said, there's really no type of show, if you want to call this a show, on YouTube to do with strength and conditioning like this, but even for triathletes, it's non-existent. So again, when you're kind of listening to this each week, hopefully a big part of the motivation for actually tuning in each week is like, you can't get this elsewhere. It's a bit like, if you go on your other triathlon or endurance channels on YouTube, you go on there because it's great information, it's consistent, and there's no other place you can get it from. That's hopefully where we come in.
Yeah, and of course you like the people that are presenting it, which is
hopefully.
Hopefully, fingers crossed.
We shall do our best. Should we get stuck in then?
Yes.
First feature for today is to do with tightness. So as a triathlete, particularly with your lower back, as an example, you can get tight through there, and other muscles as well, you can get tight, hamstrings, calves. And one thing that we recently spoke about and wanted to address is, when is tightness a bad thing and you want to maybe stretch it out? And when actually is tightness maybe not a bad thing and you don't need to worry about it so much? So Craig is a bit of an opener.
I think, well, we discussed that essentially one of the big areas was tightness in hamstrings. That's where this conversation came forward from. And we'd probably say that's one of the areas, or we'd definitely say that's one of the areas which it's probably a good thing that it's tight, and it's probably tight as a byproduct of another area in the body, for instance, the lower back being tight. On the opposite side of the coin, we talked about the lats obviously being huge muscle producers in terms of force in a swim, and how tightness through them can often restrict movement of the shoulder blade and also sort of have a major effect on swimming in a negative way. So it's not always a case of that tightness is a bad thing, and it's very context dependent, I think.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of good examples there in terms of, I think the lower back one's a great one. It's one I like because I'm a good example. I've had back problems since I had my first back spasm when I was about 14, moving turf with my dad. Wrote about it a bit, so you might know the story, but nevertheless, my tight hamstrings came after my lower back, and if I stretch my hamstrings, it makes my back worse. Now, that's not to say that no one should stretch their hamstrings. It's just an example of where that tightness is actually doing me a favour, and actually leaving them as they are is a good thing. But tell us again, what about you obviously said about lat muscles and the influence on how your shoulder operates when you swim, and that tightness maybe not being a good thing.
Yeah, so
paint a picture for us.
You know, in any good strength conditioning program for triathletes, you would train your lats in various pulling movements. But alongside that, you also need to make sure that you are stretching your lats, and it's one of those areas, not like your hamstrings, that you do need to keep on top of from a lengthening perspective, partly because they have such a huge effect on allowing the shoulder blade to downwardly rotate. Obviously, as you extend your arm through the water, that movement in the shoulder blade becomes absolutely critical.
Yeah, so you've got a fully extended shoulder blades upwardly rotated.
Yeah, and as we come through, we're effectively pulling the shoulder blade down to rotate. Obviously, if the lats aren't doing their roll and they're short and they're tight and they're restricted, you're just not going to get that movement to its full ability.
Yeah, so as you've explained, my shoulder blade's now upwardly rotating, so as I'm coming in to catch the water, if that lat's tight, I'm not going to upwardly rotate as well, am I? And consequently, again, if you've been coached on your swimming or whatnot, chances are you're not going to reach in as effective position, or you're not going to have as much stability through the shoulder. So when you pull, you're not going to generate as much force because your lat basically downwardly rotates your shoulder as you pull through the water.
And as a byproduct of that, you, by essentially having a slightly reduced stretch out in the water, can impede and lead on to other things, and they might not necessarily be connected to your lats being tight, but they're a byproduct of that. So we talk about shoulder impingement, which is one of the things, just by essentially effectively reducing that arc and coming across the body because you are tight through there, can lead to different things happening.
So, I mean, the two great examples there. I know we dug a little bit deeper. So again, with this, any questions that people have, because we appreciate that, because we're doing this, it's not live as such, but because we are just doing it not to a script, there may be certain questions that people have. What did I mean by that? Bang them in the comments section and we can obviously answer them in regard to that. But those two examples are really vivid ones of actually, latissimus dorsi muscle, really important to stretch because we can link that to shoulder performance when we swim, and also injury prevention from swimming shoulders. But then we can link it to another injury case with the lower back where actually the hamstring's tight, not because it's causing a stiff back, but the stiff back is causing the hamstrings to be tight, maybe because it's trying to protect the lower back. Whereas obviously the one that you said is essentially if you've got tight lats, that's going to be the thing that causes you problems, or it's part of one of the things that causes the problems to reducing shoulder performance. And we all want strong, powerful shoulders, whether it's to pull through the water, or whether it's to grip those handlebars and not feel like our neck's on fire. It all matters, doesn't it?
It ties into another conversation we had in terms of neck pain, doesn't it? So, huge in that area. But again, you can't take that umbrella approach that just because it's tight, it needs stretching. It's very context dependent.
And I suppose before we move on to the next point, that's why we always really like to reiterate as a huge point of value, not just because triathletes like you are time strapped, but why you should see stretching work as very focused on, I'm going to stretch this muscle because it's going to help with this, which is linked to my triathlon, rather than just the notion of, I'll just stretch anywhere and it will do some good.
Yeah, it goes back to exactly what we've said in terms of strength work and even your other disciplines that you're running. Everything has a purpose, and in that case, it's exactly that.
Cool. So stretching does matter. Be focused with it. Don't always see tightness as a negative. There's sometimes reasons why the body does get tight and stiff, but I do think with stretching as well, always respect the fact, like I think I put in an email, if somebody has got tight hamstrings and they think stretching them makes them feel better, go for it.
You see that in a lot of sports, don't you? Gymnastics is one where they go through such maybe traditional routines and stretching, but they don't necessarily offer performance benefit, but they're so ingrained in that process of doing that.
It gets them ready to perform, and that's the nature of art, science and art. We talk about science a lot, but because we coach what we do strength and conditioning full time, we understand there's the art and the human factor to it. So we're not going to sit here and say, well, you shouldn't do stretching because actually scientific evidence has shown that isn't strength and conditioning coaching. That's just somebody reading some research. So Yeah, I don't know where I got that voice from.
That was good though, I was impressed.
One topic that we've touched upon and really got a lot of really good feedback on, because I think it's quite eye-opening, is to do with how muscles work when you cycle. So actually in the background you can't see this 3 evil looking watt bikes lined up, and as I look at the pedals I can actually picture what this science that we're just going to cover talks about, but also hopefully we can expand a bit on how that can be used to help you with your strength and conditioning to actually improve the cycling element of your triathlon performance. And actually it would have a knock-on effect anyway to your running. So the research, we've done a few things on this, actually shows that when you think about cycling, you just think about quads, don't you?
Oh, hugely.
I mean, you've got bigger quads than me, Craig, and I know size doesn't matter, but anyway, I digress. Quads do matter, but this research shows actually a number of other muscles also play a really important factor. So if we look at the first, so when we turn a pedal on the bike, 360 degrees, a circle. If we look at the first 90 degrees, and again, don't nitpick me on this, I know it's not exactly 90 degrees, but I'm just trying to paint a vivid picture. First 90 degrees approximately, quads are one of the most significant muscles that are used. However, also, gluteus maximus, one of the biggest muscles in our body.
Big peachy one.
Yeah, big peachy muscles are in the buttocks. They also act to really apply force into the pedal. Then if we look at the second 90 degrees, that almost takes us down to 1:30 on a clock. Actually, quadriceps and gluteals don't play as much of a factor. They're still there, they're still working.
Yeah.
Our calf complex, so our gastrocnemius and soleus muscles in our calf come into play, along with our hamstrings. And then really the last key bit is the last 90 degrees, where our quads tend to come back on in again. So yeah, I mean, it obviously shows that lots of muscles actually play a role.
Yep.
What do you think in regards to helping our wonderful viewers in terms of how can that help them with their strength training?
Like you kind of touched on there, it paints a picture that hopefully it paints the picture in the sense that you can't just train one particular muscle group and get the same reward. I think by training all those muscle groups mentioned, the hamstrings, the calves, the quads, and obviously the glutes, you are going to add more tools to that toolbox. You're going to get a better chance of recruiting more musculature, so therefore producing more force on an even pedal around the stroke, because you are training the right muscles that have such a huge impact on that during the different phases of that pedal stroke. You know, as triathletes, you're always trying to aim for that efficient pedal stroke, and that is one of the most effective ways you can do it, by just adding in different tools that you can utilise through that pedal.
Yeah, it's a good point. So if you are looking at kind of that efficiency pattern, if we've said certain aspects or certain points of the pedal motion influenced more by certain muscles than others, and if that's a weak link, again, if we're training from a strength perspective, all of those muscles, we're going to be limiting any weak links, aren't we?
Yeah, so you know, I mean, if you've ever used a watt bike, obviously Dave's already mentioned, we've got them here. One of the things is that sausage sort of illustration on the graph that you're trying to achieve, and not those dead spots. Well, those dead spots are more likely to occur if you are not producing as much force in a particular muscle group at a different phase. I know that I've been guilty of that in the past. I think we were talking about the other day in the sense that I know when I get to sort of 180 degrees on the pedal stroke, I know that because of when I'm about to introduce those hamstrings, previously that's where I had that dead spot. I'd rely on these to push the pedal round, and I was losing force, naturally getting tired through there. So
I suppose all of the depth aside is, if we've developed strength through our strength training to mean that all of those key muscles produce more force, we know that that's actually the key, the mechanism, as we'd call it in our industry, the thing that actually unlocks the performance enhancement that you see through strength and conditioning for cycling, which essentially is to be able to, at a given speed, just use less oxygen. And it's because you're not relying excessively on maybe one muscle group more than the other. And because now the capacity of the muscle to produce force is much greater, it means then at a given speed, whatever speed that is, whatever it might be, the muscles as collectively aren't having to work as hard, you use less oxygen. Happy days, we're going to be in a much more better position. I think the other thing that it helps with when you actually look at exercises is, we've spoke about this again actually not too long ago, but how it's not about training muscles. that factor does come in because we've just spoke about muscles, but a really good way to keep it simple so you do train the right muscles in the right way so it transfers is to look at things from a movement perspective. So if you imagine when somebody's cycling and that the pedal's going around, if you picture their hip, their knee and their ankle, you can see how you get changes in the angles of those things. And essentially, if we're training in and around those movements fundamentally, we're going to be recruiting and using and training and strengthening those muscles. So if you actually looked at a split squat as an example, and you looked at cycle revolutions, fundamentally the same things are going on. Hip flexion, knee extension, hip extension. Very similar things, and I know there's a little bit more depth to it, but again, I think it's always a good thing tying in that type of science is if you just want to keep it simple, train strength-wise in and around the movement, and you're going to be on to a winner.
I do think completely, following on to that point, there is a stigma around exercise, and if we take over, the common one is always the back squat. I think that you've all, to get a good reward out of back squat, you've got to sit with your backside right to the floor, deep ranges. Well, most triathletes, including myself and Dave, will not get to those ranges, partly because we have stiff ankles from running. But that doesn't mean to say that exercise becomes redundant. Certainly we can get really good gains from that by just essentially going down to a bench, which for most people is just above 90 degrees or even at 90 degrees. Well, those ranges of motion, those angles are very specific to cycling, so there's no real need to go any lower. So it's erasing that kind of stigma around that.
Yeah, that's stigma. That's a good word, isn't it?
Sexy.
Sexy word, yeah. I'll have to keep that each week, sexy words. But I think that's a good example to finish on, because through understanding you as a triathlete, it makes you look at strength training as a coach through actually your eyes and not through some wishful thinking. So in strength and conditioning, the view is if you want to do a squat, you've got to go ass to grass, deep to the floor. Now, if you can do that, okay, great. Some really good benefits of doing that, because essentially you're lengthening muscles a little bit more. You might get a greater amount of certain things physiologically that go on with the muscles that cause things to adapt better, blah, blah, blah. But we know, as Craig says, really, triathletes can struggle with that because of what our bodies have to do to be able to do triathlon. And I think some people sometimes get a bit frustrated. I can't do that exercise because here isn't working. I can't squat, my back's rounding, doesn't matter. Essentially, if you're still getting in those angles that we spoke about, you're flexing your hips, you're flexing your knees, and then you're extending both of those, you're not going to go far.
It's always a continuum of risk and reward, I think, with exercise selection. If you can get more reward out of something and you're safe, you're not going to injure yourself, but it's going to produce to performance gains, then I'm all for it. If the risk is too high, then maybe not.
I'm all for it too. There we go.
So Dave, here we are again. We're ready for the weekly episode of In the Bin or In the Gym.
Pressure.
In the bin meaning that we're going to keep it, it's good, we're all for it. In the bin, the opposite. We're getting rid of it, it's out of here. So we're going to start off, Dave, Swift for triathletes.
In the gym, don't use it myself, but great tool, great for competition. If you want to stitch your mates up, if you've got a bit better than them, social element to it that people like, sense that you're kind of in races, particularly good during lockdown, I'm all for it.
Leading on from that, Strava segments.
Strava segments. Good for the ego, but not so good necessarily for the old psychology. Most of the time, is when people compare themselves to one another, particularly when things aren't going so good, everything goes wrong, everything goes down the pan, there's frustration, you think it's the end of the world, and again, it's that sense of comparing yourself to somebody else. I don't think it really lends itself in the long term for good psychological or good motivation for a triathlete. So yeah, a bit of fun, people take it too seriously.
The energy drinks, in particular Monster, fizzy drinks.
Phenomenal. I will say sugar-free ones, obviously if they're loaded with sugar, not particularly good for the old body composition or probably just health itself. If you're training plenty, if you've got a demanding life, lots of work, practical way to get caffeine in. Look, I love coffee. Actually, I love coffee more than the word love can describe. But having a nice cold caffeinated beverage to get away from some of that hot caffeine, actually it was the highlight of my day today. That might give you an indication of how exciting my life is. Apart from doing this video, obviously. So cold, sugar-free energy drinks like a Monster. No, Monster, you haven't actually paid us to advertise for you on this, so get your act together.
plyometrics for triathletes?
In the gym. But if you read an article in a magazine, you see plyometrics, amazing, scientifically proven to improve the speed I can run at, and then you go out and do a load of bounding, probably not a good idea. We know that if you haven't got good levels already of leg strength, going into plyometric training is probably not the best thing. That's why in the strength and conditioning profession, we always say strength training is always the fundamental thing that you do foremost and at the start. Then plyometric training is the icing on the cake. You never use it instead of your strength training, you use it to complement it. But you only do that when you've already built up a good sound base of strength. And actually, your strength training is going to give you better returns at the start anyway than wasting time with plyometrics when you're not used to doing strength training. So get it in the gym. But again, when you see those headlines in magazines about plyometrics, just take it with a pinch of salt.
Deadlift as a strength exercise for triathletes.
I will put that in the gym. It will go in the gym. But I'm going to give another but. Certain deadlifts, I think, are pretty solid and safe. Hex bar deadlift works for most triathletes because of the fact you're not having to get, your centre of mass isn't too far forwards. It's a little bit more safer on the lower back. You don't need to get too deep into it. You don't need lots of thoracic extension. It can work pretty well. Conventional deadlift, I think you start to go into the area where that can be a little bit more tricky for triathletes in general to do effectively well because it is maybe a little bit more back dominant. Your weight's a bit further forwards. It's riskier in terms of you're probably more likely to use poorer technique. But look, deadlifting in general, if it's done great, fantastic tool. Hip extension, knee extension, massively important for all areas of triathlon. Technique's king though on that one as always.
Okay. Netflix murder documentaries.
Ooh.
Different this one.
I love a Netflix in the gym, and if you sit down in an evening and you put your feet up and you put on your Netflix and you scan, you go on the crime bit, particularly in lockdown periods where there's not much on the telly, there's rubbish. You've got to keep it real. These things happen in life, and these things happen. I love a documentary.
Beatles.
The Beatles. The band The Beatles.
Yeah, the band The Beatles.
What's your favourite Beatles song? You don't know any, do you? But do you know what? In the bin. Now that's going to say, I'm just thinking that from the context of I'm sitting in a gym, I'm thinking about training. Am I going to be wanting to listen to Yellow Submarine when my heart rate's at 170 beats per minute? It's not really going to work for me, but great music, Lennon McCartney, like Strawberries and Cream, just like that. Great musicians. But I'm thinking Beatles in the gym if I'm training. Yellow Submarine, oh Jude. Not for me, I'm afraid.
Endless swimming pools.
Endless swimming pools. I'd love one. I've never used one. And I think I'd really struggle to actually use one effectively. And I like the idea of it, you know. I'm just going to go into the garden, I'm just going to smash out a few lengths. Well, not lengths, because I won't be doing lengths. I don't know what you refer to it as. I like the concept. Quick, easy. It's not always easy to go to the swimming pool. I travel half an hour each way. But I do think I'd be rubbish at it. And I can imagine it turning into a toasted sandwich maker. It's one of those things that you have and you know and you think, yeah, I'm going to make loads of toasted sandwiches. But actually, after a few months, you'll be sat having a coffee at your coffee table one day and you'll look outside and you'll see you in the swimming pool and you're like, yeah, I should probably use that, shouldn't I? So I think I'm going to put it in the gym. But with the disclaimer that I think I'd be useless at it. Sit-ups. In the bin with the lid on top and put into a skip. I remember doing sit-ups when I was about 12. Yep. In my bedroom, teenager. You want to look like who would have been then? I don't know.
Arnold, maybe.
Arnold.
Arnold.
Even back then, I knew I was never going to look like Arnold. But you want to be ripped. You want to look like the guy on the front of Men's Health or whatever it is. So you do your sit-ups. But again, thinking in regards to triathlon, not the best way to do your core. It doesn't train your core like you use it. So how many times do you use your core to bend your spine? In every case, swim, cycle and run, you use your core to stop your spine moving. And I always think, even though there's not really a huge amount of science on it, that if you have got a history of having a bit of a bad back, it's probably not going to help my bad back that much. So I'm in the bin, lid on top, in the skip. There's better ways to train the core, isn't there?
Yeah.
And if you need to find out ways to do that, you can find them on this channel.
Yeah. Well, Dave, that concludes this week's episode of In the Bin or In the Gym. I'll certainly have a think about topics for next week.
And I think we'll have to put you under pressure in there. You'll have to do one of these at some stage.
Yeah.
Welcome to our weekly feature called the Technique of the Week, where we're going to be covering a strength training technique that you can use as a triathlete to correct very common problems that we see triathletes like you use with their strength training, but with a little bit of know-how you can correct and get much more bang for buck when you're in the gym. So what we'll do, we'll have a little stroll around. You can see our man Craig here is in the picture. So Craig's going to do an example of a pulling exercise. So we've used a half kneeling band pull. So if we watch him, if he goes into a couple of reps, there we go. A couple of things going on here. Now you can really see how he's leaned back. So if we just move around a little bit, his chest is very elevated and you can really see how he's leaning back, and he's doing that because he's trying to use his muscles down here, his lumbar extensors, to help pull the bands. Problem is we're not trying to train those. Another example, if we pop on up, there we go. If we're going to use an example of a pull up or a chin up, so really common exercise that will be used. Now if we come around the side just a little bit more, what can sometimes happen again, if we see him going into that motion there, up he goes. Now Craig's pretty good at these, so he doesn't show it maybe as well as some other people, but at the bottom of the movement you can see a big arch in that lower back, and usually that's because the core relaxes, which means you can almost whip your spine into a position that allows you to go up a little bit more, as opposed to correcting it. So what we'll do, we'll go back to the other exercise. So that's what we're trying to avoid, because essentially we're starting to use other muscles to help create the movement which we're not wanting to train, and as soon as we use muscles that we don't want to train, we're taking the work away from the muscles that we do want to train. So on this example, what we're trying to use here are muscles that really retract his shoulder blade here. What we're not trying to do is have these work at the same time. So if he's doing it correctly, you can now see actually his spine isn't moving. So if you look at his lumbar spine here, there is no movement. The only place that he's moving is his elbow, his shoulder, and his shoulder blade. So do a bad example again, just to reinforce it. Now that's a really obvious example, but even subtle versions of that, again, are really going to take away from you using the muscles that are going to help you with your triathlon performance. Now if we go back up to the chin up, so with the chin up, one of the key things is to make sure when you lower on down, you don't almost relax your core. Now, I don't think you should think about your core when you're doing this. What you're wanting to think about is avoid having your back arch. So again, if we just show that back arch position when you hang. So here, there's a really big arch in that position there. So what you want to do, if you do a rep, when you come down from that rep, just think about staying compact in your torso. So as Craig comes down, he's going slow there, he's just showing off, isn't he? He wants to think, or you want to think about just staying compact in your middle, and that will avoid you just from going into that overextended position, which we know can mean we're taking work away from the muscle that we actually want to use. So summary of today's episode. First one, tightness isn't a bad thing. No. Sometimes have it point, be focused with your mobility and stretching. It will save you time and it'll have greater impact in terms of your performance. Yeah. Other closing thought?
Muscle recruitment, as in when you're planning your programming, or we're planning it, just being considerate of the ranges of motion and the movements that occur alongside the muscles that are involved.
Splendid?
Yep.
Other factor, tune of the week, going back to, I found out, I think it was 1989, 1990, Public Enemy, Fight the Power. Fantastic. Yeah. Fantastic, or at least I think it's fantastic anyway. Not Hey Jude.
No, or Yellow Brick Road.
Or Yellow Brick Road.
Yellow
Submarine. Or not Yellow Submarine. So, Public Enemy, Fight the Power. Quote of the week. What's quote of the week?
A really good one, I think, was consistency is a superpower.
Did you make that up?
I don't. I will have a colleague of mine, Ed, who will claim that he came up with it.
Consistency is a superpower.
Yeah, but I tend to think, actually, it's probably true.
I agree, it is. If it was easy to be consistent, everybody would do it. And we know from coaching people, it's a tough thing to do.
Exactly.
And the final tip was on our technical section, any upper body exercises, strength exercises that you're doing, your lower back, your spine in that regard should not move. Great way to think about that is to almost pack your rib cage down tight, like concrete, or imagine again your spine is literally like a steel rod. It cannot move, it has to stay vertical, it has to stay upright. And finally, aside from all of those things, subscribe, like, comment and ask questions. Check out the support that we provide across the world with our triathlon strength and conditioning online. And apart from that, it's goodbye from Craig.
And it's goodbye from Dave.